Now, this afternoon, we begin from the Central Region capital, where former Finance Minister Professor Kwesi Botwe is due to deliver a lecture at the University of Cape Coast. He's speaking on the topic Ethicality, Democracy and Development. The lecture is the 6th since President Atta Mills died whilst he was in office. Let's take you live now to the main auditorium of the UCC for that lecture by Professor Kwesi Botwe.
There are ideas from Professor Botwe who will speak to us. And the topic he's decided to speak on, which I believe is dear to his heart, and he will want to elaborate on it so we all get a good understanding of it, which will be in memory of former President, the late Professor Atta Mills. He started the topic Ethicality, Democracy and National Development, the legacy of President Atta Mills. I believe that we'll all cooperate to listen to him and to take useful lessons home. For those, I believe that we are ready, I'm ready, our speaker is ready, and we'll have a good time. Thank you very much.
Prof, thank you. And earlier I noted that as and when I'm prompted of the guests available, give them the due acknowledgement. Would you also just give a hand of applause to the Regional Minister, Mr. Kwame Duncan, who is on the high table. So you're most welcome. We'll give attention to the guest of honor who is gracing the occasion this afternoon with his royalty, and is in the person of Osaberima Kwesi Atta II. Please indulge me, let me give a little bit of attention to him. Osaberima Kwesi Atta II attended Government Boys School, now Philip Kwaku Boys School at the Saddle College, Cape Coast, and the College of Administration, Achimota, where he obtained the intermediate ACCA. He then proceeded to the College of Commerce and Distribution in Glasgow, Scotland, and qualified as a professional accountant, ACCA. He's a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, Ghana, and the Ghana Institute of Taxation. Osaberima has ever worked with the Internal Revenue Service as an investigating accountant, Deloitte & Touche, a firm of professional accountant, as an auditor senior, and then as a partner. He's also married with 5 children. Let's welcome our special guest of honor.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, distinguished Vice Chancellor of the University, the Senior Minister, my friend Osaberima, Nana Mahim, distinguished colleagues, comrades, ladies and gentlemen, Nana, actually, what you didn't realize is that ministers of finance belong to a club. We respect one another because we each know what that office has. I'm delighted to have been asked to deliver this year's and the 6th John Evans Atta Mills Commemorative Lecture. Fifi, as most of us call him, was a classmate of mine at the University of Ghana Law School, and a friend with whom, and this is little known, I shared a common passion: field hockey. In my youth, when I played I played hockey for Cornerstones. I don't know how many of you remember Cornerstones. And actually, Fifi was one of the few who continued to call me by my erstwhile Christian name, Eddie. Completely undeterred by my valiant attempt at wiping out what I thought was a colonial intrusion in my given name. Actually, when I went to the States to study, this was in the late 60s, the black was at its height in the United States. And I and a friend of mine who was from Kenya would go to, social gatherings with African Americans, and each time they would ask, "What's your name?" Of course, we told them Eddie Bochwe and John somebody. But then we realized that they were in the process of indigenizing their names. So you ask them who they were, and they say, "Yeah, somebody," and please something. And each time we said Eddie or John, they looked at us funny. One of them would say, "Nigga, your name is Eddie?" So we kind of got tired of all this. And so I decided that I will just have my peace. But Fifi never recognized the change. Now, as I set out to sort of contemplate the contours of the subject that I had elected to speak on, it occurred to me that I might just pause and reflect on whether people generally would readily see as a legitimate focus of Fifi's commemoration. Now, a quick thumbing through of the torrent of tributes that people paid him upon his sad and bewildering demise confirmed quickly that everybody saw him the same way I did. It was a gratifying and somewhat predictable affirmation. The most common and recurring theme of tributes to him was his humility, his decency, qualities that are at variance with the popular perception of politics and politicians. Indeed, politics is a dirty game is a common saying that more than sums up this popular perception. Today, I'd like to explore with you what these qualities and humility that everyone saw in President Atta Mills really mean, and how they matter and are relevant in our national development and our nascent democracy. Indeed, this is a conversation that has assumed even greater poignancy and significance in the equally painful loss of our former Vice President, Pakwesi Mr. Arthur, whom Fifi appointed as the governor of the bank, and whom we are mourning as we speak. And about whom, just in case anybody missed it, the same virtues were widely recalled in teeming tributes. I speak advisedly about ethicality. Now, just in case any one of you might feel it is a little dense, ethicality, think of ethics, it is something that straddles the terrains of honesty, humility, and decency, and a concern for the moral quality of any course of action we canvass as leaders and as politicians generally. Thus, taken in its broad sweep, ethicality does not simply mean being a nice person, being a nice guy. Indeed, President Mills himself spoke in a number of his State of the Nation addresses on the subject. In one, he pledged to always be guided by a principle he had long cherished, he said, to always strive to make the right decision rather than a hasty and expedient one. The right decision. He spoke about his commitment to creating an atmosphere of inclusiveness, respect, and courtesy in our national discourse and debate, and I quote, and to doing away, he said, with the style of politics that, and I quote, mistook democratic transfer of power opportunity to wreak vengeance. He took a decisive stand and was determined to break the cycle of vengefulness that still besets the nation and often sees businessmen, contractors driven to ruin, that sees even public servants on occasion more or less summarily dismissed for barely disguised political reasons. All of this behind a veil of profuse legalism. More importantly, it was his natural inclination to ethical principles that gave him the supreme courage to put the interests of the people, especially the middle to lower ranks of the civil society, above his personal popularity and that of the party he led, by ordering the implementation of the single-spine pay policy, a policy that was adopted in the dying days of the Kufuor administration, President Kufuor's administration, in spite of the huge challenges it posed for the management of our wage bill and for the nation's fiscal situation generally. I'm sure my good friend Osafo knows exactly what I mean. Thus, ethicality connotes something deeper and has many dimensions which have been widely noted by researchers, academics, and analysts, trust them, over time. Some have even spoken of a code of ethics for politicians, although I don't know that that's where we want to go. One can almost intuitively identify some of the components of ethicality that mark the man we are commemorating today. Those that readily come to mind include his integrity, his honesty and rectitude, his transparency and open-mindedness, his commitment to responsibility and accountability of public officials, his impartiality in the management of conflicts, disputes, allegations and counter-allegations among appointees and institutions. As I'm sure many of you who worked with President Mills would know, he vigorously encouraged whistleblowing as a powerful way of holding public officials and persons accountable, but also as a sign of ethicality. He would typically detain the whistleblower by having him or her wait in an adjoining room to his office, then invite the person or persons against whom the allegations had been made, and then have the whistleblower come out of his waiting place and repeat exactly, and I mean exactly, what he or she had come to report to him. He insisted that it be just the same thing the person said, in the same language, preferably. Many an axe grinder turned whistleblower fell on this ethical sword and were often sent packing with rather stern admonitions from Fifi. Don't come here again. President Mills understood that an important part of the job of shoring up the integrity of government and ensuring its accountability was also to curb the incidence of what I call the informal layers of power. People who hold no formal offices and thus cannot be held to account, but are known to actually wield enormous power and influence on policy making, including the allocation of and disbursement of resources, public resources, and even in the communication of government policy. These informal layers of power are not unknown in well-established democracies where they create similar tensions. But there, they are restrained by more elaborate and effective controls and arguably even accountability. While there are clear rules that deal with what has been termed government ethics, with this particular focus on the regulation of conflicts of interest and whistleblowing, in the holding to account of office holders, no such regulation is possible. Nor is the establishment of standard criteria for individual responsibility possible with these behind-the-scenes power brokers, or what I call the informal layers of power. Now, special mention must be made of President Mills's abhorrence of arrogance and hubris that is often associated with a pretense at omniscience, knowing everything, having all the answers and solutions, having all the brains. A failing that sometimes leads to a parading of time-honored ideas and solutions as novelties and the work of genius. And above all, his disapproval of the art of manipulation, spin, and duplicity in the communication of government and even party positions to the citizenry and to the media alike. Just listen to him again in his 2010 State of the Nation address, and I quote, "Nobody has a monopoly of either vision or wisdom, and we take honest criticism in good faith. These are virtues that are not exactly in abundant supply in our nation today, alas. There are virtues that obviously mean very little to autocratic governments, for obvious reasons. They don't need the people's consent to do anything. However, we must understand that they help to sustain the legitimacy of democratic governments. Moreover, as one analyst puts it, the permanent presence of an opposition force, to wit, an opposition party, is a necessary condition of the power of government. The idea is thus not to press into consensus or silence the parties which do not belong to government after the last elections. The winners are winners because they are losers who recognize their defeat, but still continue to disagree. The idea is not for incumbent governments to bludgeon opposing political parties and civil society organizations into acquiescence through blackmail or threats of criminal investigation, prosecution, or persecution. In PF's worldview, those who aim to stay in power, well, almost permanently, through these methods, cannot claim to be true Democrats. They have no place for ethicality in the conception of governance. All this is to say that President Mills was greatly concerned about the ethical principles that should regulate national affairs. And this because he understood that it had implications for the consolidation of our national democracy and our national development. Now, the basic tenet of so-called modernization theory suggests a relationship between economic development and democracy is normally tested through cross-national or cross-national time series, if there are any economists here, global analysis. And although it is by no means universally agreed among scholars and researchers, there is a substantial body of literature that suggests there is some correlation between democracy and economic development. Although many places in the world that have seen the most phenomenal development have seen this happen under autocratic regimes. There are many policy issues of national development, including the challenges of fiscal consolidation, of taxation, public investment strategies, that need cross-partisan support, even where the incumbent party has the requisite parliamentary majority to adopt them. Investors, especially foreign ones, look at the buy-in of opposition parties to critical government policies in assessing country risk to long-term investments. Now, these were the considerations that were on his mind when he spoke of putting an end. These were the considerations that were on President Mills's mind when he spoke of putting an end to the cycle of vengefulness and recriminations in political transitions in our country. There are, of course, criticisms of political ethicality, the quality we are touting as the essence of President Atta Mills' legacy. There are those among them, academics, analysts, and even practitioners alike, who believe that politics is a dirty business anyway, and that the talk of political ethics is almost a contradiction in terms, and is unrealistic, and places needless constraints on politicians, especially those who operate in a representational capacity and must sometimes take decisions and make judgments that are at variance with their own moral standards. Yet others object that political ethics focuses too much on particular policies and policymakers and politicians, thereby ignoring the cause of larger injustices in the society generally, such as poverty, inequality, which a powerful individual may not be able to do anything about by himself. But these criticisms don't really vitiate the fundamental perquisite of President Mills' ethicality, defined not as some moralizing code, but as a commitment to a set of principles that guide actions and policy choices that political office holders and leaders make. In his case, it included his commitment to the fiscal discipline and macroeconomic stability and employment-generating growth, as well as the legacy projects that were undertaken under his leadership. Now, so far, we have spoken almost entirely about the relevance of Professor Mills' concern for decency and ethicality at the national level, at the level of governance. But it has a place as well in the management of the party, of party management of the party that he led to victory and housed in its current address. Indeed, the loss of ethicality had a lot to do with the party's defeat in 2016. In the work that I chaired, thanks to the decision of the National Executive to involve me in that important endeavor, we identified, and the party is aware of, the incidents of divisions, of grievances, of bitterness over what many saw as the manipulation and breakdown of integrity in the selection of executives at various levels of management of the party's affairs. from the branch upwards. The report also noted the influence, careerism, and the waning of ideology and the commitment to principle. The party, the National Executive, have heeded and have been chastened by the findings of the report, and happily are busy working to ensure that these principles are reinstated in our culture as a party. And I'm gratified that this has been done largely very, very successfully. As the party strives to close ranks and restore ethicality in its organizational setup, it bears reminding of the meaning of our national democracy. National democracy is a phase in the struggle of ordinary people for justice. It's a phase of the struggle in which the masses of the people recognize that they, by themselves, cannot win the struggle for justice without allies. Without allies in all democratic forces in the country, but especially in the ranks of the social forces that form the natural ally, if you like, to this phase of the struggle. The working people, farmers, civil servants, nurses, students, and the teeming masses of the unemployed. These are the natural allies of social democracy. And ethicality in policy making, in campaign strategies and messaging, in relations with other political actors, the media, all that is extremely important, and also underscores the need for training for a better understanding of social theory and the roots of our social democracy. Mr. Chairman, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, nations often sow the seeds of debilitating conflict. Ever so slowly and imperceptibly. It is not seen while we're doing it, while they're doing it. Nations often sow the seeds of debilitating conflict, ever so slowly and imperceptibly. Many among them, ordinary citizens, clergymen and women, the extreme polarization that appears to be taking hold in our nation. We need to step back from the brink and begin to ethicalize our politics by curbing the spate of vengefulness and recrimination in the land. And the surest way of stemming the tide of this raging polarization is to broaden the processes of consultation over critical matters that affect the common good, such as any program that tinkers with the institutions of our democracy and education system, such as by fighting corruption, not by replacing one cohort or group of corrupt individuals with another, not by replacing crude methods of rent-seeking and wealth acquisition by more subtle and, above all, by tolerating criticism, especially constructive ones, rather than angrily dismissing them, by forever pointing to the sins of the past, as if we are engaged in a race to the bottom. This would be a fitting tribute, in my view, to a great president who, in his own words, sought to do away with the style of politics that mistook democratic transfer of power as an opportunity to wreak vengeance. I thank you.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we want to give you the opportunity to do a little bit of stretching. But remember, this is purely intellectual discourse. And so we'll be hearing from a number of the brains up here. Euphoric Choral, it's your time.
Those are live visuals from the University of Cape Coast, where Professor Kwesi Botwe is delivering, or has just finished delivering, the commemorative speech in honor of former President John Evans Atta Mills, in which he speaks a lot about ethicality and how he thinks that is important in crafting national policy, ethicality in party structures, by which he says, by the way, that the NDC is restoring what he describes the NDC as restoring some of these ethicality tenets in the party structures. Ending that commemorative speech was a very profound statement on polarization and how people should not just angrily dismiss people because they have different views, but to broaden the scope of the processes of consultation to reduce polarization in this country. And it is indeed the 6th Atta Mills commemorative lecture that is ongoing at the University of Cape Coast.